Isn't that a weird thing to say? Let's go down to William in Aliso Viejo, California. John Piper wrote a new book called Providence. Are you planning to read it? What's your view of Piper's teaching? I'm not planning to read it, but I am planning to look it up right now. Let's see here. If we can find just a little bit about it. Providence by John Piper. Looks like there's a website here. New from best-selling author John Piper. Providence. Went all out in the cover art, didn't they? Let's see. It's sweet and bitter providence. The providence of God is his purposeful sovereignty by which he will be completely successful in the achievement of his ultimate goal for the universe. God's providence carries his plan into action, guides all things towards his ultimate goal, and leads to the final consumption. The book explores the goal, nature, and extent of God's purposes in the world. Piper offers an invitation to know that the God who holds all things in his hand, yet remains intimately involved in the lives of his people. Now, this is, it sounds to me like the Heidelberg Catechism. And the Heidelberg Catechism or Heidelberg Confession is one of the main, I won't look it up right now, but I'll tell you what it says. It's one of the main sources of Reformed theology. John Piper, of course, holds to Reformed theology. Because John Piper holds to Reformed theology, his theology is wrong. His theology is not based upon the Bible. His theology is based upon the Bible as read through the eyes of the Heidelberg and the Westminster Catechism and or confessions. And those are wrong. In our series, What is Reformed Theology? I go into some of this more, and I think I even have at least a segment, maybe an entire session on providence. And the providential view of the Heidelberg Catechism, or the Westminster Catechism as well, is what John Piper is teaching here. I can tell just by reading that. It almost sounds like those confessions. It is the view that all things come from God's hand. I believe that that is the wording of the Heidelberg, if I'm not mistaken. All things come from God's hand. That is, everything comes from God's hand. That is, it was God that kicked me off Facebook, not Mark Zuckerberg, it was God. It is God that blew up the soldier's leg in Afghanistan. It's God that aborted those babies. All things, yes, all things come from God's hand. It's God's hand that makes the stock market go up and God's hand that makes the stock market go down. All things. It's God's hand that, made my hair fall out and let dear William keep his hair, assuming he has hair. All things, every little thing. That's the providence of God in John Piper's view. John Piper, honestly, can I just say this bluntly? He doesn't even know the gospel. Let me show you, and this is old, but excuse me as I put in a few things. Here we go. Yeah. I should screenshot this article because someday it'll go away. As we forgive our debtors. Let's see. There we go. Our greatest risk, losing heaven. Now, if you go back to this, I think this is like 1992 or 1994. They needed to repair the organ at the Bethlehem Baptist Church up in Minneapolis area that he was pastoring at the time. And some people wanted to do the expensive repair of the organ. Some people didn't want to do the expensive repair of the organ. They were happy with the guitar or whatever the replacement was. And they began to fight within the congregation. And John Piper said, no, we don't do this. And he preached this sermon. The greatest risk we face as a church these days is not that we may lose an organ, or that we may lose money, or that we may lose members, or that we may lose staff, or that we may lose reputation. The greatest risk is that we lose heaven. Because one way to lose heaven is to hold fast to an unforgiving spirit and so prove that we have never been indwelt by the Spirit of Christ. If you don't forgive the guy that wants to spend the money on the organ, you are going to hell. You are not saved. That's a guy who has read his Bible. He's never rightly divided the Bible. He just doesn't get it. He doesn't understand grace. He has, just like we talked about John MacArthur the other day, he has a works-based salvation. And it's a works-based salvation because he can't rightly divide. Now, I know there are some out there, no, John Piper is the greatest proclaimer of the gospel there is. Look what he said. The greatest risk that we, the members of the Bethlehem Church, have is that we may lose heaven. Had it, lose it. It's unbiblical. And so why would I want to spend the time reading yet another John Piper unbiblical book? And really, I used to read some of his, the first book I ever read of Piper, I kind of liked. And I was a little too naive and dumb and young. All those things go together. Sorry, young people. But it's right, isn't it, Nathan? Naive, young, dumb, all goes together. Right? He grudgingly admitted it. I was young, naive, dumb, and he wrote a book called Brothers, We Are Not Professionals. I actually, still to this day, like the premise of the book. And the premise of the book, it was for pastors, and the premise of the book is, we shouldn't be in an ivory tower. We're not professionals. We are people who walk with the people, who have lunch with the people, all that. It's a good premise for pastors. And the professionalization of the clergy, as separate from the laity, has been a bad thing. I agree with this premise of the book. He even wrote a book, a chapter in that book. I still remember the name of the chapter. It was called Blitzer Was a Banker. Blitzer was a banker. And in that, he talked about some banker named Blitzer, and he talked about how Mr. Blitzer, the banker, when he studied the Word of God, he would go and use Greek tools, and he would study the Greek. And his point was, if Blitzer's a banker and he can use Greek, then Randy the preacher should use some Greek too. The banker can handle it. The banker can do it. You preacher, you can do it. Now, some good things in that book, honestly. It was probably his best book. Everything from there that I have read or looked at, and again, I haven't read his new book here, and I haven't read one of his books in years, but what I look at is he regurgitates Reformed theology. And this is one of the problems with Reformed theology is they really don't think for themselves. Both a bad and a good thing in dispensationalism, depending on how you look at it. When you get dispensationalists, there is such a wide variety. You can say, well, Andy Woods teaches this way, and Randy White teaches this way, and our friend Brian Ross teaches that way, and our friend David Reed, he teaches that way. And they're all dispensationalists, but they have some very different views on some things, and friends. Now, it's nice when it all comes together, and every time you read what Randy White says, it's going to agree with what Andy Wood says, and that's going to agree with what David Reed says, and that's going to agree with what Brian Ross says, but it doesn't work that way. Because dispensationalists are much more free thinkers, independent thinkers, and so we don't have this set of catechisms out there that we regurgitate. Reformed theology, it doesn't matter if you pick John Piper or John MacArthur or R.C. Sproul, they're all just regurgitating the Westminster Confession. And so the value of reading a book is only to see how this other guy regurgitated it. They've got such groupthink in Reformed theology that, I don't see the value in reading it. I wouldn't waste my time or money on John Piper's new book. Go read the Heidelberg Confession, and you'll have it. Read the section on Providence in the Heidelberg Confession or the Westminster Confession. You'll have the same thing that John Piper is going to write. You'll just miss the illustrations. Light. I have developed and built a relationship now with a Jewish publisher that publishes mainly from an Orthodox perspective. That's the perspective I like to read Judaism. It has less mysticism in it.